of migration, but not what we might expect as a traditional investigation of migration. It's not looking at people, for example, coming to the United States and then integrating into American society. Instead, what it does is it looks at the politics of migration, hence the title, how states, and in this case, the Ottoman Empire and the United States, approached the migration of Armenians. Armenians, for those of you who don't know, are a Christian ethnic group based in the Middle East and the Caucasus region. They were, for several hundred years, largely under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Many of you might be familiar with the Armenian genocide, which took place during World War I and largely ended Armenian presence in much of what is now Turkey. This book looks at the migration of Armenians from the Ottoman Empire to the United States in roughly the 3 decades preceding the Armenian genocide. So Polly mentioned the 1885 to 1915 time frame. 1915 is the year that the Armenian genocide began, and that is kind of the cutting off point for this large-scale migration between the United States and the Ottoman Empire of these Armenians. So I am going to, again, this is unique for me here, I'm going to share my screen here. I have a couple of images. Here, let me close that. Okay. I'm not particularly image heavy here, but do we see the image on the screen? Yeah, okay, good. I can see people's heads nodding. So I'm going to go to share screen. Come on. There we go. All right, so I'm going to start with a story, and this is an image that is on the cover of my book. And I want to lead off with this story because it really illustrates the major themes that my book addresses. So the person that you see, I'm not sure, you can probably see that cursor there. The person that you see lying down here with the X, and I have to say, this is I love this picture, right? It's a picture of somebody taking a picture. This image here is of Ohannes Topalian. And Ohannes Topalian is a character that I discuss at some length in the book. He was born in the Ottoman Empire in the early 1870s in a little town called Gurun. And here's a map of the Ottoman Empire. This is in Serbian. You can ignore the Serbian, that's irrelevant for us. To give you an idea of where he's located, right, this would be modern Turkey here, Cyprus here, Lebanon, modern day Bulgaria, Greece. He was born here, a little town called Gurun in 1872. In 1891, at the tender age of 19, he decided to migrate to the United States, as many of his fellow Armenian young men were doing, beginning in the late 1880s and early 1890s. So in 1891, he travels to the United States, and as we'll talk about, this was not a straightforward journey. This was a difficult journey for reasons that will become clear soon. He eventually ends up in Providence, Rhode Island, where he works for several years in a factory in Providence, making money, sending money back to his family. In 1897, after 6 years of living, just about 6 years of living in the United States, he decides to naturalize as an American citizen. So he adopts American citizenship in 1897, and the next year, perhaps, I don't know, perhaps filled up with patriotic fervor for his adopted home country, with news of the American ship, the Maine, blowing up in Havana Harbor. He decides to enlist in the U.S. Army, and he is sent to Cuba, where he fights in the Spanish-American War. And that is what this image is from, right? This is Ohannes with his Spanish-American War buddies, with their Martini rifles and their late 19th century vintage U.S. Army uniforms. So he fights in the Spanish-American War. He then, after the war ends, he returns to Providence. He receives an honorable discharge from the U.S. Army. So, he is considered to have fought with valor. And then in 1901, 3 years after the Spanish-American War, he receives a letter from his father back at home, asking him to return. His father has arranged a bride for him back home. So in 1901, Ojanes returns to his home community in the Ottoman Empire. He marries, he has a child, he settles down for a few years back in the land of his birth. But then in 1907, 6 years after he returns, he decides he wants to return to the United States, return to his adopted country with his wife and his daughter in tow. And so he makes a journey. So he's actually living in the city of Kayseri, which is not far from his hometown of Gurun, where he's working, living with his family. He makes a long overland voyage to the city of Sivas, about 100 miles to the north and east of Kayseri. This is where the closest American consulate is to the city where he's living. So he goes to Sivas to visit the American consul in hopes of obtaining a new passport, which he hopes will aid him and his family's return to the United States. So he appears before the consul in 1907 in Sivas. He gives the consul information the consul would need as proof that Ojanes, is in fact an American citizen. So he provides his naturalization record. He provides his the certificate of honorable discharge from the U.S. Army. He even performs military drill for the U.S. consul to prove that in fact he is who he says he is, that he is not only an American citizen, but also a decorated American war veteran, and so therefore worthy of the full protections of citizenship, should be granted this passport to assist in returning back to the United States. The consul, looks at Ojanes, looks at all this information that Ojanes has provided him. Certainly, he doesn't doubt the veracity of his claim that Ojanes is in fact an American citizen, that he had naturalized as an American citizen in good faith. But the consul responds to Ojanes's request for a passport in the negative. He says, "I'm sorry, I can't help you. Because you decided to return to the Ottoman Empire, hiding the fact that you had naturalized as an American citizen," and we'll get to this point, why this is an important point in a second, but because you returned to the Ottoman Empire, and when you returned, you did not make clear to Ottoman authorities that you were an American citizen, you have, from the view of the American government and from the view of this office, have effectively forfeited your status as a naturalized American citizen. So despite the fact, again, that he had served in the U.S. Army, that he had this proof of American citizenship, the consul tells him effectively he has forfeited his American citizenship in the eyes of U.S. consular authorities in the Ottoman Empire because he returned, and because when he returned, he did not make clear the fact of his naturalization to Ottoman authorities. So Ojanes is no doubt dejected, right? He had made this long trip in the hopes of getting a passport. That request was denied. So he actually shows up a few months later in the archival record, this time in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. So he clearly makes it out of the Ottoman Empire. This time he shows up in Alexandria, visiting the U.S. consul there, asking for the same thing, asking for an American passport. And he receives the same answer from the American consul in Alexandria. Sorry, there's nothing we can do for you. In our eyes, you have forfeited your status as an American citizen. So I'll return, and if I don't do this, please remind me in the question and answer period. I'll return to Ojanes's story at the end of the presentation to give you an idea of what happened to him in the end. But his story touches on a number of very important aspects, or the most significant aspects of the book, and what the book aims to discuss. And so there are really several questions that emerge from Ohanes' story that my book seeks to answer about the broader question of Armenian migration to North America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One is, who are the people who leave for the United States, and why do they do so? Number two is, how did they leave? How did they leave the Ottoman Empire, and what are the challenges that they faced? C, why did Armenians choose to return to the Ottoman Empire? Why did people like Ohanes come back? Right? Why do people who migrate abroad decide eventually to come back? And D, why did Ohanes's question of naturalization? Why was he rejected by the U.S. government, and why did this become an issue to begin with? And how does this play then in the broader sort of frame of the Ottoman state's relationship with the United States government? So those are the big questions that my book seeks to address, not only about Ohanes, but more broadly about the Armenians who are migrating back and forth between the Ottoman Empire and the United States. So to address this first question, who is leaving and why? So Armenians in the Ottoman Empire live primarily in this area here of what would now be Eastern Turkey, and hopefully everybody can see my cursor moving there. So this is primarily where Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire. You also had some Armenians who lived here in kind of southern Turkey, and then also scattered in some of the major cities of the Ottoman Empire, like Istanbul, Aleppo, Izmir. But the vast majority lived, again, here in the Ottoman East. This is a region that did not have access to things like railways. So there were no railway connections to this part of the Ottoman Empire until long after the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. So we're talking about this being a relatively isolated region. Armenians were, in addition to being a minority population, there were probably roughly 2 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And even in the regions where there were the largest populations of Armenians, they were primarily a minority population, right? This would still have been a majority Muslim, in most areas, majority Kurdish-speaking region of the Ottoman Empire, of which Armenians would have been a substantial minority. And again, many of you have heard about the Armenian genocide that took place in 1915, in which the vast majority of this Armenian population that lived in the Ottoman East was either deported to the Syrian desert, some fled to the Caucasus Mountains, which was under the control of Russia, and then many hundreds of thousands were outright killed by the Ottoman state and irregular forces working in tandem with the Ottoman state. That the Armenian genocide that took place in 1915, and again, to serve as a reminder, here, this migration that I'm talking about took place before 1915, so it's pre-genocide. There was nonetheless, in the late 19th and early 20th century Ottoman Empire, increasing persecution of Armenians. Armenians were the target of increasing persecution and even outright violence at the hands of Ottoman authorities, as well as local officials and local populations in the Ottoman East. And so the general assumption has been, well, why are Armenians migrating? Well, they must be migrating to avoid persecution. And indeed, in the mid-1890s, between 1894 and 1896, there were a wave of massacres and pogroms directed at Armenian populations in many different communities of the Ottoman East. So it seems like a pretty cut and dry issue, right? This is escape from persecution. The problem with that narrative is that the vast majority of Armenians who are migrating in this period are, like Ohanes, young men. Many of them are not married. Some of them are, recently married. And their goal is not necessarily fleeing persecution. Again, they're leaving in many cases, leaving their families behind. But rather, they're seeking work. They're seeking to benefit from the high wages in the United States, to send money back to their home communities, maybe to eventually return to their home communities, whether to buy land or maybe to reunite with family and assist in their families migrating to the United States. There could be many reasons here. But first and foremost, throughout this period, this migration is primarily driven by these economic concerns. And persecution, while it does play a part, I don't want to neglect or suggest that persecution isn't a driver of Armenian migration in this period. It's just to say it's not the primary driver. And also, Armenians are not migrating from this entire region, right? Instead, there are certain communities, especially in and around the small town of Harput Mezre, right here in kind of central, what's now modern-day central eastern Turkey. And you can see this place here a little bit better here on this map. This area, this area right here in the Ottoman East. The vast majority of Armenians in this period are not coming from, again, this entire region here, but rather this area, which is about a 50-mile radius centered on this small town of Harput Mezre. And what I argue in the book is the reason why Harput Mezre in this area has especially high rates of migration is because Armenians here are generally more prosperous than Armenian communities elsewhere in the Ottoman East. Migration, if you're going to migrate abroad to make more money, right, it's in itself a huge risk, right? The rewards are high. If you make it to the United States, if you get a good job that's going to pay maybe 10, 15, 20 times higher than what you could hope to make in a job in the Ottoman Empire, if you make it to the United States, the reward is high. You can make a lot of money. You can save that money, save it, send it back home. And so if you can make it there, again, the benefits are right, even though, again, wages in the United States are relatively low. They're still far better than what anybody could expect to be making in the Ottoman Empire. Nonetheless, in order to get to the United States, it's extremely expensive. It's a huge risk. And so those who are able to take the risk, and this is a similar dynamic that you see in the 21st century, often people who migrate, so-called economic migrants in the 21st century, are usually not the poorest of the poor, but rather they're people who can afford the risk of migration, who can afford the costs of migration. And in the 21st century, it's often very expensive for populations to migrate, in part because states that seek to prevent populations from migrating. Here we can think of, say, Central Americans trying to come to the United States. Right? The United States has, over the past 20 to 30 years especially, erected pretty strong barriers to migration. Those barriers dramatically increase the cost of migration, whether you're trying to migrate through legal channels or through unlawful channels. We see this dynamic too also on the Mediterranean Sea today, where you see people from South Asia, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa who are trying to migrate to the European Union. The efforts of the EU to clamp down on that migration raises the price of migration itself, because migrants have to go through smuggling channels. They have to go through irregular channels of migration that cost more money than it would simply to buy a plane ticket and fly to Paris, which isn't possible, again, for most migrants coming from the global south. So this makes migration a much more expensive, much more risky endeavor than it might be otherwise. And the same dynamic is at play at the Ottoman Empire, because there's another aspect to this question. When Armenians start migrating in large numbers in the late 1880s to the United States, the Ottoman state, which at this time is controlled by this autocratic sultan named Abdul Hamid II, who is deeply fearful of threats to his regime, his government views the emergence of large-scale migration of Armenians from the Ottoman East as being tied up, as being one and the same, as being a phenomenon that is one and the same as these emerging Armenian political networks that are starting to develop and emerge both within the Ottoman Empire, but also in Russia, in Europe, and in the United States. These are political organizations that are arguing either for outright independence, the creation of an independent Armenia out of the Ottoman East, or significant Armenian autonomy in the Ottoman East. The Sultan's government views the emergence of these political organizations as an intrinsic threat to the Ottoman state's control of this region. And his regime also views migration itself as being tied up with the emergence of these political networks. So his regime wants to put an end to this migration altogether. In part because what they're fearful of, you might be thinking, well, if they're leaving, isn't that a good thing? If they're leaving the Ottoman Empire, wouldn't the Sultan be encouraging that, right? Fewer Armenians means less of a problem in this kind of calculation. But what the Ottoman state fears is not only people leaving, but also people returning. Understanding that migration is not just a one-way street in which people leave and don't come back, but rather the concern here is people are going to leave, they're going to go to the United States, they're going to benefit from the freedom of speech and freedom of association that exists in the United States. And this is exactly how the Ottoman state is framing this question. They're going to go to the United States, they're going to benefit from these silly freedoms that the American system gives to people to criticize governments, to associate into dangerous political organizations. And then they're going to return to the Ottoman Empire and they're going to cause all sorts of problems. So again, this is the concern that's driving this desire to prevent migration. So in the late 1880s, the Ottoman state officially bans Armenian migration to North America, again, along the lines with the idea in mind that migration poses a serious political threat to the empire. And so Armenians are forced, those who want to go to the United States, people like Ohannes Topalian, are forced to leave, as migrants do in the 21st century, through irregular channels, through smuggling networks that begin to emerge in and around the Harput Mezre area that link this area and migrants who want to leave it to ports of exit on the Black Sea coast, places like Trabzon, Samsun, also on the Mediterranean coast, Mersin, Iskenderun, as far south as Beirut. So these are these very highly coordinated networks that connect migrants to boarding house owners, government officials who are assisting clandestine migration, boatmen who help to row migrants out to waiting ships that are waiting just offshore, and then like clandestinely board them onto these ships. So we're talking about this whole dense networks of smugglers who help Armenian migrants leave the empire in the face of this ban on migration. And again, over time, these networks become more sophisticated, but also they're deeply expensive. So to migrate unlawfully, and I did the calculations here, adjusting for inflation, migrating through these smuggling networks cost something like roughly $10,000 to $15,000 if we were to adjust for inflation in 2020 dollars. This is a very expensive, and again, this is similar to what you see in the present day, right? Migrants today spend often upwards of $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 to migrate through these irregular channels. Often this is financed through debt, so migrants take on considerable amounts of debt to migrate through these channels. Same thing is going on in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But this isn't to help people get into the country, but rather to help people get out. So in that way, it's a reverse of the present scenario. But nonetheless, the dynamics are very similar to what you see today in the 21st century. So this is likely how Ohannes Topalian and many of the others, and I forgot to mention that roughly 65 to 70,000 Armenians migrate to North America in this period. And so many of them migrating in this period when migration to North America is outlawed by the Ottoman state. So you're talking about tens of thousands of people migrating through these irregular channels. So that answers two of our questions: who these people are, why they're migrating, three, I guess, and how they're doing it. Another important question when it comes to Ohannes' story is why and how do those who leave return? And so to get to this question of why, right, I found many reasons for why migrants return, right? There isn't one simple answer. So migrants might return because it had always been their intention to do so. They want to use the money that they've saved up while working abroad to invest in land or maybe to buy a small shop, something like that. So you see that kind of thing where it's a more permanent return. But you also see examples of people who return because they want to visit family, right? They want to visit elderly parents or help elderly parents who may have retired. You see people returning because they've been injured or have become sick while abroad and they want to convalesce in a more familiar landscape in their own home communities. You see people return who are looking to return to get married, start families, and eventually go back to the United States. So return, just like migration itself, isn't a one-way street. Return migration isn't a one-way street. People return and then we'll go back, sometimes multiple times. This isn't unique by any stretch in the Armenian case, right? If you look at, for example, southern migrants from southern Italy in the same period, if you look at even unexpected, like Irish and Jewish immigration in the same period in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You'll also see similar dynamics of people returning, sometimes permanently, oftentimes on a temporary basis. And again, we're considering this is an era before airplanes, right? This is a very, very long trip. For Armenians who are leaving or returning to the Ottoman East, right? It can be 2 weeks just to get from the coast to the interior, or vice versa, from the interior to the coast. And then you have to wait for tickets to be arranged to make the long sea trip to a European port city and then across the Atlantic to the United States. Or if you're returning, you're doing that same trip in reverse. So we're talking about trips that take very long periods of time, and nonetheless, people are doing this. So I estimate that in this period when both Armenian migration, but also return migration are outlawed by the Ottoman state, that, and this is a conservative estimate, at least 15% of Armenian migrants who leave to the United States eventually return, either on a permanent or temporary basis. And I think that number might actually be considerably higher even than that. So a return migration is not an uncommon phenomenon. But again, as I've mentioned here, the Ottoman state views Armenian migration as intrinsically threatening. It is a threat to the political order of the Ottoman East. The Ottoman state is very worried, especially about not only Armenians leaving, but coming back. So just like Armenian outmigration is banned, so too is Armenian return migration. And this gets us to the central question about Ohannes' story. Right? How is it possible that Ohannes Topalian, who had naturalized as an American citizen, returned to the Ottoman state to get married on a temporary basis, still seemed to view himself as an American, had a desire to return to the United States, had not forsaken his adopted country? How is it possible that when he sought assistance from the American consul, he was denied? He was told that effectively he had forfeited his American citizenship by returning. Well, this gets to this question about how both the Ottoman state is viewing Armenian return migration, but also about how the U.S. government views this coming and going. So when Ohannes returned to the Ottoman Empire in 1901, he could not come to an Ottoman port and present an American passport. If he did that, he would have been detained by Ottoman authorities for having migrated unlawfully and having had naturalized as an American citizen unlawfully according to Ottoman law. So he would not have been allowed back into port. He would have been detained and eventually deported. So to avoid that, to avoid being essentially debarred at port, when he returned, he did not return bearing his American passport. Rather, when he arrived at port, he probably said something along the lines of, I've been working in Alexandria, Egypt, the past few years. I'm an Ottoman subject, and I simply want to return home to return back home as an Ottoman subject. So he never, when he returned, would have made it clear that he was an American citizen. If he had done so again, that would have resulted in him being debarred from the empire, and he would have been forced to go back to the United States. Again, he wants to get back home. He wants to get married. So in this period, when you have large numbers of Armenians returning in the late 1890s and into the first years of the 20th century, In the middle part of the 1890s, you have large numbers of Armenians returning, say 1894, 1895, from the United States. These are people who had gone to the United States relatively early in the 1870s, 1880s. They've adopted American citizenship. And so you have these people who are returning to the Ottoman Empire in the mid-1890s, 1894, 1895. And they're being arrested and detained by Ottoman authorities. And oftentimes they're being detained for sometimes weeks on end. They're being mistreated. And so these Armenians who have American citizenship, who have returned on American passports, they complain to American consular officials. Again, this is in the mid 1890s, and word gets to the U.S. press that the Ottoman Empire is detaining Armenians who have American passports for the sole fact that they're American citizens. And this creates this firestorm of negative press in the United States about how could the Ottoman Empire be detaining our citizens? How could they be violating the sovereignty of our passports? So this creates, again, this firestorm in the United States about the mistreatment of American citizens. And this is taking place against the backdrop in the mid-1890s of these massacres against Armenians that are taking place throughout the Ottoman East. You have American missionaries who live in the Ottoman East who are writing these reports to the press about these massacres. So regularly in 1894, 1895, the American reading public, those who are opening the New York Times or the Washington Post, they are encountering both these stories of violence, of Ottoman violence, capricious Turks murdering innocent Armenian Christians in the Ottoman East. And alongside that, they're also reading press reports of American citizens of Armenian descent being detained at port in the Ottoman Empire and being detained for the sole reason of being American citizens. And so, again, the Ottoman state finds itself in the middle of this firestorm, of these bad press reports. But the Ottoman government has an ace up its sleeve. They have a very savvy ambassador in Washington, a guy by the name of Mavroyeni Bey. He is a Greek Christian whose family has very, very close ties to the Ottoman Sultan. He also knows very well American high society, and he has his thumb on the pulse of American politics. So it's his job, the ambassador's job in the mid-1890s, to begin crafting a counter-narrative. How do we counter these negative press reports, not only about the massacres of Armenians taking place in the Ottoman East, but also these negative press reports about the Ottoman state detaining American citizens of Armenian background at port. And so what he starts to do is he contacts his friends, his buddies with press connections and with political connections in the US. And he starts encouraging them to publish editorials presenting Armenians as a dangerous migrant group, right? The 1890s are a time of furious anti-immigrant backlash in the United States, not all too different than what we see today in the 21st century. And so migrant groups like Jews from Eastern Europe, Germans, Italians are being portrayed in the 1890s as, and of course before that in the early 1880s you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which almost completely bars Chinese from coming to the United States on the basis of there being a kind of cultural, civilizational, racial threat to the United States. A similar kind of political discourse is beginning to emerge around other migrant groups in the United States in the 1890s and toward the beginning of the 20th century. Here I'm thinking about the image of the Italian anarchist or the German revolutionary socialist who seeks to undermine political stability in the United States. This is the kind of narrative that Mavroyeni and his allies are trying to craft about Armenians. Armenians are like Italian anarchists. They are a threat, not only to the Ottoman Empire, but also to the United States, right? They seek to undermine politics, not only in the Ottoman Empire, but also in the United States. And there is a very uh, fertile ground for this kind of narrative to take root, in which Armenians are viewed increasingly not as a group worthy of sympathy, but rather as a dangerous migrant group. There's a reason the Ottomans don't want the Armenians to come back in, because the Armenians are a danger. And so you start to see, by the late 1890s, editorials being published in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, talking about Armenians in this way, as a dangerous group, as troublemakers, as people who do not naturalize as American citizens in good faith, right? Rather, they're trying to use their American citizenship as a flag of convenience to go back to the Ottoman Empire and stir up trouble there, and then seek the protection of American officials when Ottoman authorities respond to their troublemaking. And this works. In 1901, the American State Department issues a directive that says, kind of in response to this diplomatic wrangling between the United States and the Ottoman government, that any Armenian who returns to the Ottoman Empire and doesn't make the fact of their if they have naturalized as an American citizen, if they don't make the fact of their naturalization known to Ottoman authorities, they will, from the perspective of the U.S. government, been deemed to have forfeited their American citizenship. And we tend to think of American citizenship as something that doesn't go away, or certainly can't easily be stripped from somebody unless they commit treason or something like this. What this reveals is that, especially when people are outside of the United States in this context, American citizenship is actually quite fragile. There really isn't a clear definition of, especially at this time in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, of the extent to which American citizenship and the status of American citizenship remains stable when you're no longer on American soil. And what this case proves is that, in fact, the State Department and American diplomatic officials can essentially revoke citizenship in this context by fiat, can decide essentially on the spot whether a person is eligible to seek protection as an American citizen. So what this State Department directive does is effectively strip the American citizenship from those naturalized citizens who had returned to the Ottoman Empire after 1901. And this is the reason why Ohannes finds himself in the circumstances he finds himself in 1907 when he visits the American consul. He's found himself stuck in between the emerging kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric that's taking hold both in the United States but also in the Ottoman Empire. In both cases, viewing migrants as dangerous, viewing people who cross borders as inherently politically dangerous. And so Ohannes Topalian, again, despite being a decorated war veteran, despite certainly giving pretty solid evidence that he had full desire to return to the United States as an American citizen, it doesn't help him in this case. And so what happens between 1901 and 1908 is that as a result of this directive, the Ottoman Empire begins deporting several hundred Armenians who had returned to the Ottoman Empire after unlawful sojourns in the United States. And what I mean by deport here is that they're arrested after having arrived back in their home communities. They're forced to march to usually the port city of Samsun on the Black Sea, where they're thrown on a ship and sailed out of the Ottoman Empire. And these people who face deportation in this period, they cannot go to the, unlike, again, these Armenians who had returned in the mid-1890s, they can't go to American consular authorities and ask for assistance. They can't ask for help because, again, for the vast majority, since they returned without making the fact of their American citizenship known, they are, from the perspective of American diplomatic officials, consular officials in the Ottoman East, they're assumed to have forfeited their citizenship. So that's Ohannes's story. That's the broad historical context in which it fits. In 1908, a revolution effectively overthrows the regime of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. A new constitutional government is introduced in the Ottoman Empire, this constitutional government lifts the restrictions both on migration, out-migration, and return migration. So between 1908 and the beginning of World War I, you see a massive spike in both out-migration and return migration, now that people can come and go freely. So this completely changes the dynamic of this migration story. But when World War I begins and the Ottomans join the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans face almost immediately invasion from Russia, an attempted attack on its western flank from Great Britain. It's in this context that the Ottoman government embarks on this genocidal campaign against Ottoman Armenians in the Ottoman East on the flimsy grounds that they pose a direct threat to the Ottoman war effort. This is the justification for this campaign of mass deportation and mass extermination. Many Armenians who had naturalized as American citizens or were the dependents of those who had naturalized as American citizens. So this is in a period before citizenship had been essentially degendered, right? So for women, for dependent children, your citizenship status was linked either to your father or your husband. So an Armenian working abroad who naturalized as an American citizen could extend his citizenship to his spouse and his dependent children. So you also have spouses, dependent children of American citizens who, in the context of the genocide, seek assistance from U.S. consular officials. And those who had returned as naturalized citizens to the Ottoman Empire find that they cannot seek the protections of U.S. citizenships. They find that they can't enlist the help of American consular authorities to avoid deportation or to avoid massacre in the context of the genocide. So this again even has implications going forward into World War I and during the Armenian genocide. So again, this is a story that touches on numerous important points about, again, late Ottoman history, the history of migration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Armenian history, but also I would argue understanding the dynamics of migration and global migration that exist today in the 21st century. That a lot of the themes that I discussed here today by no means are unique to this context, but rather remain significantly important, again, within the broader question of global migrations. So with that said, I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to stop sharing. So, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Yes, okay, Lawson says yes. I guess everybody's on mute. So I'll open this up to any questions you might have. I notice there are already some questions here. I haven't seen any of these because I had it on share screen. So, so I could, if you'd like, I could just I could read the questions, or I could ask the people who pose these questions. Daisy, if you wanted to pose your question to the entire group.
I actually posted it on the chat. So yeah, my question was, since they had the migrants that you described were from the middle and kind of eastern part and had some money, I was wondering, well, why would they leave? They were better off compared to everybody else around them. And I know they would have made maybe some more money in the U.S., but they were pretty. It sounds like they were, okay in that area. They were like the middle class or maybe upper middle class. So that was a question that I had.
No, so it's a good. Oh, go ahead.
More persecution than economics.
So so part of the reason why this, when I say prosperous or when I say better off, what I mean is more economically stable. So, for example, Armenian communities further east were more likely to face not only economic immiseration, loss of land, very high taxation, both from state and non-state groups, but also in some cases outright violence. So rather than looking at it necessarily as prosperity, I see this more economic stability. The economic conditions in these communities where there are large-scale migration to North America are more stable, so therefore allow for people to take this risk where you can earn some money, send that back home, perhaps buy some land, and be relatively assured that that land isn't going to be taken from you by force, that your family isn't going to face robbery or even violence. So rather than looking at it as prosperity and wealth, rather it's more of an issue of greater economic stability. And on top of that, migration had long been, in this region more broadly, a central part of the economic survival of households in these regions. So migration and earning money, whether in Istanbul or Aleppo or other major cities in the Ottoman Empire, that had already been kind of part of the economic calculation. This is how households survive. They engage in, some people in the household engage in agriculture, some might maybe in small-scale household manufacturing, and young men migrate temporarily to earn wages in the big cities. So how I view migration to North America is an evolution. So rather than going to Istanbul, you're now going to Providence, or you're now going to Boston, where you can earn even higher wages, which can help make your household back at home even more stable and economically secure than it was before. So that's the argument here about the economic role of migration here. Is not that things are, not that everybody's wealthy and doing quite well without migration, but rather migration helps to improve economic security, and a baseline of economic security that other Armenian communities, especially elsewhere in the empire, don't enjoy. Okay, so let's see. I'm trying to see other questions. Lawson, it looks like maybe you had a question. Is that the case, Lawson? Are you there? Oh, Greg? Okay, Greg, go ahead.
Hey, David, how are you?
Doing well.
Great talk. I enjoyed it very much. It was interesting to hear some of the parallels in my own research on Latin America. Years ago, I read a book by Sam Bailey that explored Italian immigration to New York City and to Buenos Aires. And in that, he argued that immigrants that came to New York City were basically low skilled and were poor because the Industrial Revolution had already taken place. Whereas in Buenos Aires, the Industrial Revolution was taking place then and they needed skilled workers. And so because those skilled workers actually went to Buenos Aires, they actually comprised a rather important part or important component of the industrialization process in Buenos Aires and became quite wealthy and had a huge impact actually on the cultural and social development of Buenos Aires. Interestingly, you also have a very large Armenian population in Buenos Aires that immigrated during the same time, although most of them came as a result of the genocide to Buenos Aires, as opposed to what you described in your talk. And I was wondering if you see or I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but if you see parallels in terms of specific classes of immigration. In other words, those who actually came, for example, to New York City, Armenians that settled in this area. You mentioned that they had the resources to come here, right? Where I'm not really sure that was actually the case, or maybe it was the case actually in Buenos Aires. I was just wondering if you're familiar with that at all.
So I can actually, so it's a great question, and you can see actually a similar dynamic with, so Armenians are not the only group who's migrating from the Ottoman Empire to North America in this time. You have Muslims, you have Assyrian Christians, you have this very large population of Lebanese, both Christians and Muslims. So from modern day Lebanon and Syria, who are going to the United States at the same time, late 1880s, early through the first decades of the 20th century. So large numbers of Lebanese who are going to the United States, but they're also going to places like South America, Mexico, the Caribbean. These are the Turcos, who they're known in throughout much of Latin America as Turcos or Turks, even though they're primarily Arabic speaking. And again, this is paralleling this large-scale migration of Armenians to North America. But in stark contrast, where again Lebanese are going not only to the United States but also to South America, Central America, the Caribbean, even to West Africa. Some are going as factory workers, many are going as peddlers, small shop owners. It's a much more diverse set of professions that Lebanese migrants are getting involved in, whereas Armenians, at least before the genocide, are almost exclusively, those who are going as labor migrants are almost exclusively working in factories, or almost exclusively doing non-skilled industrial labor. So the dynamics driving Armenian migration in that way are very different, especially before 1915, than what you see with the Lebanese. And again, it's because, or at least my argument is because Armenian migration to North America maps on to these earlier dynamics of migration. So Lebanese, for example, didn't migrate in large numbers within the Ottoman Empire. So there wasn't this this earlier history of regional migration that then the Lebanese built on by going all over the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In contrast, there is this larger, earlier history of regional migration in the Armenian case that then they're building on by, rather than going to Istanbul, going to places like Providence and Boston instead. And just like in Istanbul, they were usually doing what we might call low-skilled work as porters, working in tobacco factories, this kind of thing. They're doing similar kind of labor in the United States. But again, in both cases, what's driving it, the interest is in the wages that they can make doing this work. And what's especially attractive about the United States is how much higher the wages are doing that kind of work in the U.S. than they would be in a place like Istanbul or Aleppo.
Okay, great, thank you.
Other questions? None? Nobody?
I just wanted to say that I enjoyed it, and I'm glad I attended, and it was very interesting.
All right, thanks so much. Thank you for tuning in. Hopefully this format worked okay.
It was a great talk, David. I really enjoyed it.
All right, thanks so much.
Wonderful.
Yeah. All right, David, I'll ask one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go
ahead, we're here.
Yeah, because I had a second question. I want to give others the opportunity to chime in. I do have a question. It's a more broad-based question about the gendered aspects of migration. Oftentimes, a lot of the earlier working class studies that examined migration from the Middle East to Latin America, more specifically Argentina and Chile, that really became the bedrock of the textile industry, for example, in that region, has really elided the role of gender, within these vast migrations. And I was wondering, if you could talk a little bit about, we talked about a lot of times it is men who are migrating, right? And they're providing, they're bringing money, they're sending money back, they're leaving their families behind. But there are women who actually migrated as well. So I was wondering if you could talk just a bit about that.
Yeah, so again, I think that the parallel with the Lebanese case is instructive. So the Armenian case is overwhelmingly male, and it's gendered that way, right? Migration is gendered as male, in the sense that who's expected to leave, who's expected to go to these places in this specific context. It's men. That's not the case everywhere. Like, we can't then universalize it to say that was always the case everywhere in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was men who were engaging in migrant labor, because the Lebanese case is quite different. So in the Lebanese case, many of those who are migrating as labor migrants in the late 19th, early 20th centuries are women. And they are, one historian actually locates the emergence of large-scale migration from the Eastern Mediterranean in the collapse of the local silk industry there. And the silk, the people who were working in the silk factories were primarily women. So it was women's work in these silk factories in places like Beirut that were undercut when the silk industry collapsed there in the 1880s. So it's many of the people who are migrating are women who have lost their economic well-being in the local industries and instead then go abroad to work abroad and in search of those lost wages. So the gender dynamic of migration was very different, for example, in the Lebanese case than in the Armenian case. The Armenians who are, again, migrating abroad, at least looking for work. Now, you do have women who are migrating, Armenian women who are migrating. For the most part, they're migrating as spouses of people who have already left, or they're migrating to get married to somebody abroad. The rates of what we might call economic migration among women is much lower in the Armenian case. But again, that's historically specific to the Armenian case, right? That's not, we can't then argue that that's universal everywhere. That's historically specific to the Armenian case, and it doesn't apply, again, even in other examples of large-scale migration from the Ottoman world in this time. So it's a warning to always to think about the gender dynamics of these things as being very historically specific.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yep. Other questions?
Yes.
Any others?
I just was wondering, was this recorded because I came in late?
Yes, it has been recorded, and we'll post it on the alumni website.
Okay. Thank you. When will it be up?
Probably within 3 or 4 days.
Okay. Thank you.
And David, on the chat, there have been several thank yous, so I hope you had an opportunity to see them. But some people who have had to sign off said thank you very much for the presentation.
All right, great. Yeah, I'm seeing them. I'm scrolling through them.
Okay, good.
All right, thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Any other questions before we let David go? Anybody have any questions about remote learning? Having to shift to that for the semester? Anybody curious to know, or do you want to talk about it real quickly, David?
Well, sure. Yeah, it's. I could say that remote learning has been an adventure. I'm sure my colleagues who are still on would agree with that. So it's in a sense been a trial by fire. I would say the hardest, the most difficult thing has been trying to balance what is a much more busy home life. I have 3 young children, and of course they don't have school now, and so they're home 24/7. And my wife also works, and she's working remotely. So striking that balance between teaching, between migrating online, and then balancing that has been the greatest challenge. And I think this is something we're going to all have to think about moving forward if these conditions continue. Is how to balance these things, especially if we're online in the fall and schools are online in the fall, God forbid. And also, trying to figure out still what works and what doesn't work in terms of translating a class that I'm so used to teaching in person to the remote sphere. What I have noticed is certainly the case is that students, I think, are longing for the connection of, many of them look forward to logging on for classes just because they're getting that kind of connection with the outside world that they otherwise lack because they're in quarantine. So So you really realize how important that social and personal aspect of teaching is when that's been taken away, right?
Exactly.
You know, when you realize it's something you can't just take for granted.
Yeah. Greg, did you want to say anything about that as well, or?
Yeah, I can mention just very, very briefly. It has been very challenging. I haven't had the experience with students really staying connected. You know, in the first few sessions, students were staying connected, and now what I've noticed is that they're really there's been quite a bit of attrition. I'm down to about half my students now attending on, you know, any kind of regular basis, and many of them have shared with me their own stresses. I mean, this isn't just simply online learning. I took an online class to take an online class. I mean, folks are contending with some pretty serious health and economic challenges in their lives right now as they're trying to continue on with their studies. And so this is obviously not an ideal situation. It's something that concerns me moving forward as well. If we are in fact, doing remote learning in the fall, it will be because we're still dealing with this pandemic, and people will be strained and dealing still with other types of demands in their lives. So it hasn't been all bad by any stretch. Sometimes I think students are actually more comfortable speaking up they feel like they can be somewhat anonymous. They don't like to turn on their cameras. But regardless, I do see, regardless of how solid the pedagogy is, I still see some challenges moving forward.
Yeah. And we're still in that holding pattern until we have a decision on opening up in the fall. So
right.
Let's hope that is the case. So, well, this was wonderful, Professor Gutman. Thank you very much. And thanks to your colleagues who joined and listened to your talk as well. So I hope everybody enjoyed it, and join me in thanking Professor Gutman for a great talk today. So we promised you about an hour, so enjoy the rest of your evenings, and go back to teaching all of your young ones, Professor Gutman.
All right, will do. Thanks so much, and thank you.
Take care. You all have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Yes.